We're live. Here we go.
Is that seeing what we need to do?
Mick is writing down that we're live.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, I can see it.
3,
Takes that
2.
short.
So this is the PCI NIC training. We call it PCI NICs, NIC meaning network interface cards, even though in the future, and we'll get to this, we're expanding our PCI line to more than just network interface cards. So probably the next time we do the training, it'll just be the PCI training. This is just about 10 slides, so we'll go through it pretty quickly. You can see exactly what we're going to be talking about here. You see an example of one of our PCI cards on the side there. Going into the introduction, what is a NIC? NIC is a network interface card. Basically means it's something that will hook you up to a network. Whatever device you're plugging this card into, it will allow you to connect to a network. What is PCI? PCI is the type of connection that's being used. A couple different types of PCI, and you can see those in the picture here. There's PCI, which is the oldest version of PCI. PCIe is the newer, most common version of it. PCIX kind of came in between. It came after PCI, before PCIe. Not very common. It never really caught on. PCI cards can work in PCIX ports. It's kind of like, this is a PCI port. A PCIX port looks like this, but it's just twice as long. So it's kind of like you could still fit a PCI card in there. We don't sell any specific PCIX cards though, so really it's less important. With PCIe, there's a couple different versions. And you can see in the image here, there's PCIe X1, PCIe X16. Basically what that means is how many extra sets of pins there are. What we have here is actually PCIe X4. You can see how it has that first little group of pins, and then after that there's a kind of larger set of pins that wouldn't quite fit in this, very easily fit in this. The way PCIe ports work, anything that would fit inside of this would work in this. If you had a PCIe X1, X4, X8, or X16, they'll all work in the PCIe X16. It's like extra space that you don't need to use, but it's there if you need it.
So that PCI X1 will work.
So this is an X4 that would work in the X16. It won't work in the X1 because it won't fit. There's just not enough space there. But it would work in the X16 just because there's enough space, the pins are all hooked up, and it just doesn't, it has space it doesn't need to use. Your car will go 200 miles an hour. You don't need to go 200 miles an hour. You only need to go 90.
Okay.
That's the idea behind it. We don't have any X16 cards, as it happens. The highest we go is X8. And again, there are X1, X4, X8, and possibly X16. Profile, or the height. A lot of servers, because you're trying to fit a lot in a small space, will only have room for a half-height card. You can see we have a couple different models of cards here. If you look at how the card fits relative to the bracket, this is a full-height bracket, and this card uses that entire bracket. This is a full-height bracket, but you can see the card itself is much smaller than the bracket. Every card that we ship that is this size, which is pretty much every card we ship, actually comes with a second bracket that's just interchangeable. You can swap out the full-size bracket for a bracket that only goes about halfway, and then you could fit it into a low-profile space or a half-profile space. Some servers, and this is kind of rare, also have a 3/4 height port, but we don't carry any 3/4 height cards. We don't have any 3/4 height brackets. If we needed to find them, maybe we could. I wouldn't make any promises about that. It's pretty rare. It's not too common. In general, it's half height, full height. These are going to go into a server, so when if somebody asks me, hey, will this card work in this server? I'll go and I'll look at the specs of the server, and it might say there's one full height PCIe X8 port and then one half height PCIe X8 port. And then I'll know that one of these cards would fit in there because there's only one full height port, but two of these cards would fit in there because there's one full height and one half height, and that would fit either one of them. Terminology, these are all the sorts of things you'll hear people talking about that are kind of related to PCI cards. In some cases, they're things that we sell. In some cases, they're not. So I mentioned the different types of PCIe cards, X1, X4, X8, X16. If someone knows they have an X16 port or an X8 port, any of our PCIe cards are going to fit in there. Because again, as long as it's smaller, it'll fit in there. NIC, like I mentioned earlier, is a network interface card. It's going to connect your device to a network. Another word, another phrase for that is converged network adapter. Basically means the same thing as NIC. It's just a way to connect a device to, it's an adapter to connect something to a network, to converge the network, I guess. So if somebody says they're looking for a converged network adapter, they probably need NIC. Similarly, there's a host bus adapter. pretty much means the same thing. It can be a little more specific, but in general, if someone says they need a host bus adapter or an HBA, they're probably looking for a NIC. The one thing about that is that oftentimes when somebody is describing an HBA, they're looking for a fiber channel connection or an InfiniBand connection. And what those are basically network languages. You know, think of Ethernet as being English. It's the most common, it's the most universal, whatever. Fiber channel is Spanish. You know, people speak it. It's not quite as prevalent worldwide, but it's still common. InfiniBand, same thing. People do speak that network language. It's not quite as common. It's more technical than any of us really need to know, but basically, fiber channel and InfiniBand are generally more when you're just connecting something in a closed system, whereas Ethernet's going to be a connection that kind of connects you outside of that one little server, that one rack. You know, if you're going rack to rack or something, you might use that fiber channel and InfiniBand. If you were one of those high-frequency traders that were just in the news a couple months ago because they're making fractions of a penny on every trade that goes through, they're using something like fiber channel or InfiniBand because there's basically less overhead, so they can fit just that tiny bit more bandwidth, and they're just that fraction faster. So in a situation where there's in that one box to the box right next to it, it's a situation where you just need as little overhead as possible, as much bandwidth as possible, and so they use these special languages to do that sort of stuff. Our cards are not fiber channel cards, but they do support what's called fiber channel over Ethernet. It's kind of tough to make the language metaphor work on that one, but imagine someone's a Spanish speaker and they speak a little broken English. Think of that as fiber channel over Ethernet. You know, it's sending that language through. We'll have a 10 gig card that can handle an 8 gig fiber channel over Ethernet connection, just because it's kind of using that extra space that's there to figure out how to do the translation for you. InfiniBand, we're working on getting. Our primary supplier doesn't have it yet. They're tough to get. There's really only one supplier or one manufacturer that actually sells this stuff in the US. So we're trying to source that for ourselves. An expansion card can mean a lot of different things. NIC among them, it's kind of just a catch-all for any card you would put into your system to provide some sort of expansion. It might mean a NIC, it might not. You would just kind of need to get some more information to find out. Mezzanine cards, we get a lot of questions about these. This would be a sort of mezzanine card. It's basically, you can see the pins are in the back instead of on the bottom like we saw on the PCI cards, or on the side, however you want to look at it. These are generally proprietary. They're going into a lot of Cisco or HP servers. Cisco ones in particular, they call them WAN cards. Those are not something we offer, again, because they're proprietary. They're generally specific to that type of server, and it's not really going to be universal. If someone's asking about a mezzanine card, if they're asking for a mezzanine card, more than likely we can't provide it. A riser card, again, it's similar to an expansion card. It's kind of a catch-all. This is a picture of a riser card in a desktop system here. Basically, a riser card is just an expansion. It's saying I have one port and I need to give myself 3 ports, so I'm going to put this riser card in here to give me some extra space to work with. We don't carry any riser cards. If someone has a riser card, they might be able to plug one of our PCI cards into it. But if they need a riser card, we can't provide that. Different sorts of chipsets. Intel's the most common manufacturer designer of these PCI cards. So when possible, we try to use their designs, their chipsets, because they're kind of the industry standard, and they publish all this stuff. Once they make a new NIC card, they made their 10G copper card. We'll talk about that more in a second. They basically said, hey, anyone who wants to make this can go and make this. And so we found a supplier who can make those for us. Broadcom's probably the second biggest, and they're probably a close number 2. A lot of people believe that in certain applications, Broadcom can be better. And it's probably just one of those things that 2 network engineers can argue about, and neither of them would really be right. Realtek and VIA are a couple other chipsets that we use, typically in older cards that are maybe 100 base instead of a gig or 10 gig. Not too popular, functional. In cases where it's something that Intel doesn't support or provide anymore, we probably use a Realtek. It's just something that our supplier provides. The last little chart here shows the speeds, and you can see that there's 4 different versions of PCI. This is PCIe specifically. All the cards we offer are 2.1 or 2.2 PCIe. So as far as the speeds go, they actually go, you can see this is 8 gigabytes per second, which would actually be 64 gigabits per second technically. So we can easily handle 10 gig cards in all of our PCIe slots. PCIe 3.0 is what we're trying to get now. A lot of the InfiniBand products are PCIe 3.0. And again, that's something we don't have access to yet, but we're working on trying to get sometime in the future. And then PCIe 4.0 is one of those things that's not really on the market yet. Sometime in the next couple of years, it'll probably start popping up. But right now, PCIe 3.0 is kind of the next frontier when that's not even really too prevalent, too commonly used. There are about 20 PCI cards that we carry, but there's 6 that we stock. 6 that we generate. I mean, there's probably 7 or 8, 9 that we actually have some of in stock, but there's 6 that we have more than just 1 or 2 of in stock. And these are those. With PCI cards in general, margins aren't fantastic. When we can get volume buys, it really helps us improve our margins. So if we have an opportunity to go and buy 200 of a certain card, that can really help improve our margins because it helps us get much better costs. But as it is, historically, this is something that until a year ago, we never stocked them at all. So we were always buying onesie, twosie, 10 at a time at most. And so our pricing hasn't been great because the volume hasn't been there. So now with these 6 in particular, we're trying to improve the margins by bringing in more inventory, by keeping them more in stock, and just getting better volume pricing. You can see the images of each of those 6 kind of going around the side there. You can see this is the one unique PCI card that we have. You see it has that longer connector, whereas each of these are the PCIe. You can see this is the X1, it's the smallest, the X4, and then X8, that's an X4, and that's also an X8. So both of these are our 10 gig cards. They require the X8. This is an X4 because even though it's just a 1 gig card, it has 4 different ports. And then both these are just the 1 gig cards that are available. This one happens to be X4 just because I think it's a design that's kind of old, and if they were to redesign it now, they could probably make an X1 because it is only gigabit. But the model we still get is just an X4. So each of these, as far as the part numbers go, I have the add dash up here, but if it were something like ProLine or Tricentric or whatever, Pro dash, Tri dash, whatever it is, the root part in mass is just going to be the PCI dash whatever. And for the most part, that is the naming standard that we use. We have a couple old PCI cards where you'll see that it's AO-GSX or something like that. And parts like that come up, they are PCI cards, but they're uncommon, and as we add new parts, we're going to stick with this standard. The main competitors as far as selling PCI cards, Intel, especially on the gigabit and the 10G cards, again, they're the ones who design it, they're the ones who create this stuff, they're the name brand. We are literally just copying their designs. Fortunately for us, they publish those, and so we're able to use those designs. And so we just become the third party for Intel products. You can see across the board, we basically sell exactly what they sell, but slightly cheaper. On lower end cards, stuff up to a gig, we compete with someone like StarTech that also tries to be the third party. You'll see our pricing is generally in line with theirs. We try to be maybe fractionally cheaper, but not significantly. And then stuff like an IBM or an HP, they're probably just sourcing their cards from Intel. So they're basically taking whatever price they would get from Intel and marking it up some more. So in general, if someone's buying an HP server, an IBM server, and they need a couple cards to go in that server, our card should be significantly cheaper than whatever they would get directly from that manufacturer. Other competitors, worth mentioning, Mellanox is the one guy that I mentioned earlier that sells the PCIe 3.0 cards, the InfiniBand cards. We are trying to get those, but it has been tough so far. So we'll continue to work for it, and I'm sure at some point it'll be more readily available. But for now, if someone specifically needs a PCIe 3.0 card, we can't do it. It is one of those things that's reverse compatible, so if they're using a PCIe 3.0 card, they can probably also fit a PCIe 2 card in there. It just might not have the same functionality, it might not be quite as fast. So our card might work, it might not, it's kind of a crapshoot. Allied Telesis is another big supplier. They do not source from China, so all of their cards are TAA compliant. We are able to compete with most of their cards with their pricing, whatever, but if someone needs TAA compliant cards, then there's nothing we can do. As long as the TAA compliance is irrelevant to them, then you should be able to quote our card in place of an Allied Telesis card. Transition Networks, Netgear, they're just similar to an Intel or StarTech. They're selling these cards, and our price should be at least as good, probably a little bit better than theirs, and they're not as big players as some of those other guys. As far as our sales strategy goes, on any of the e-tailers, we set ourselves up as -AOK. On Ingram, we set ourselves up as -AOK. For instance, in Ingram, we'll have a root part set up, our add-PCIe to SFP+, but then we'll also have the Intel equivalent -AOK, so people will happen upon ours and find our pricing to be better. Again, across the board, we are better priced. It is the exact same card. If someone's looking at an Intel card and they look at our card and they say, what's the difference? In almost all cases, there is no difference. The difference is what factory was made in China, and that's not going to be really relevant to the customer. It's just Intel charges that much more because they're doing all the R&D and they're doing all the marketing and they're the name brand. We don't have to do that stuff. We're able to just sit back, copy their designs, and sell their stuff for cheaper. Again, I mentioned this is the first time in the past year that we're actually stocking some of this stuff, so it helps us to have availability. In the past, I know we lost some deals just because we didn't have cards in stock. So we are able to get stuff in stock. If one of the cards somebody's asking you about isn't one that we have in stock, we are able to bring some in stock. If it's something where somebody's anticipating, then it might be something we consider whether it's worth bringing in 100 of those just to have them for when the customer needs them. If we're going to be able to sell them anyway eventually, it's something we consider doing. Our warranty, our support, someone like an Intel, and I know we kind of use this line a little bit when we talk about our Cisco, knockoff products. We are not the big monolithic company. We are going to be here to offer support. We have, all the product managers, Patrick, whomever, able to help out on anything, and then we'll back up anything with a warranty, just to make sure that the product they receive works. I also wanted to mention that we have our USB to NIC and our USB 302 NIC products that are NIC cards, but not PCI cards. They're basically just little adapters that plug into a USB port that'll connect you to the internet. You'll have the patch cable. My laptop, small laptop, doesn't have room to plug a patch cable in. If I didn't have wireless network here, if I needed to find some way to plug into the network here, I would use one of those adapters. It's an alternative where somebody knows they need to connect to the internet, they're not really sure how they can do it. Maybe there's no space in their server, they're trying to figure something out, but they have a USB port. That would just be a good option as an alternative. Full product line, this is just from our website to show the different products that we have. I mentioned that we have some parts that use the old nomenclature, the AO-. You can see a lot of those are AO-FX, which would be the fast Ethernet, the 100 base stuff. Those are much less common, but we still have access to them. We're still able to sell them. All the cards on this page are the PCI cards. You can see that from, these are actually PCI X cards that, I don't know why we have those images, but we
Why are they
should.
red?
Our old supplier provided us red cards. Our cards now actually not be red, but it's just whatever colored board they use. And these images are all just very old images. You can see with the PCIe stuff, all newer, all from our current supplier. All the cards are green. We have a broad range of cards, SC connectors. We can get ST connectors, open SFPs, SFP pluses, RJ45. The SFP, the SFP plus, and the RJ45 far and away the most common, but there's a lot of versatility, flexibility in what we can get. I mentioned the next time we do the training, it won't be PCI NIC, it'll just be PCI because in the next couple weeks we're actually adding some new PCI cards. You can see each of these are a PCIe card with a different sort of connector. The one you see here is actually a 4-port USB connector. That there is actually an internal USB port. So there's 3 external, 1 internal. Suppose someone needs to add extra USB ports to the server. Maybe the example I gave earlier, somebody didn't have room in their server, but they had the USB port, so they added the network connection that way. Suppose it's the opposite situation. They need USB ports to hook up their keyboard or something. They only have a PCI slot, no USB ports. They can use something like this, and that'll provide them with USB 3.0. A card like this is called a parallel port. It's going to be more for legacy products. Someone has a system and they're trying to add an old printer to their new server or something like that. They would use something like a parallel port. Parallel port's not something that somebody who's buying completely new products across their server room would use, but it is something that somebody who's trying to upgrade piecemeal might need. And similarly, this is a serial connection there. It looks kind of like VGA. It's the same idea. It's more for legacy products. It's the sort of product that if someone's trying to upgrade piecemeal and they're just trying to find a product that would kind of make their system work without needing to buy a whole new server or a whole new monitor, or a whole new printer, whatever it is. They would buy something like a serial or parallel port. All these cards are going to be relatively cheap. I think our cost on each of these is no more than $10 or $11, as low as $3 or $4 on some of them. There's 6 or 7 different cards that we're getting, but kind of within those 3 categories: serial, parallel, and USB. And again, we'll have those in the next couple weeks. We'll put them up on the new website. We'll get them in stock. We have something like 100 or 200 each of them coming in. Similarly, there'll be the full profile and the half profile brackets. So whatever somebody needs, we'll be able to provide. So that's it. Are there any questions about PCI cards? I mean, the question came up earlier, who buys the stuff? Anyone with a server, anyone with a desktop system might need one of these. I mean, the reality is PCI cards are fairly ubiquitous. It's one of the ways that your server is flexible. You know, there's a certain amount of functionality built into the server, but there's certain things that need to be changed, and PCI card is one of the things that can be changed. Someone can be upgrading from 1 gig to 10 gigs, so they might take out their old 1 gig PCI cards and put in one of our new 10 gig PCI cards.
Do you ever look at the cost of Canada? I mean, I see the pricing up there. Do you ever look at like where we are in Canada as well?
We don't have access to the system.
Limited, that's why I was asking.
Yeah, so you know, we put in our costing are the same in the US and Canada, so it kind of depends how the markup is. This isn't the same as something like the accessories where it's a ridiculous markup. Across the board, the markup tends to be 10, 11%, sometimes a little bit less, just depending on the day of the week, I guess, in the US. So I would guess it's similar in Canada, but regardless, the cost we're putting in there should be close to the range of the cost the customer sees. You saw the margins weren't great, so we have a little flexibility, but not expansive amount of flexibility as far as reducing prices, unless it's a high volume opportunity, in which case we can go back to our supplier and try to get a better deal.
I've got a question. You said all our PCIe cards are by 1, by 4, or by 8. Is there an advantage to go with by 16? Is it faster?
It's more bandwidth, so I showed that little chart earlier that just showed the speeds in gigabytes per second. And you can see what it's showing here is per lane the speed.
Okay.
And this would be a 16 lane slot would be an X16, it would basically be 16 times that speed. So if it is just an X1, then that's as fast as it's going to go. If it's an X4, it'll go 4 times that fast. So you can get more speed. At the same time, if you have a 10 gig card, if you have the 10 gig RJ45, the network itself is only going to go 10 gigs. So going from that X8 to X16 isn't going to help you. There's more space there, but you're not going to be able to fill that space, essentially. So just for usability, it's better to fit it into as few pins as possible. If someone happens to have an X1 port and we have an X4 card, we can't help them. Right. So if we can provide the speed they need with an X1, we'd like to provide it with an X1.
So let's say like a 40 gig, I don't know if 40 gig cards are relevant now, but when they are, that might become an issue, right?
So when we go to 40 gig cards, we'll need to get there are some QSFP cards out there. That Mellanox I mentioned has a PCIe 3.0. It does have some 40 gig QSFP cards. And that uses the PCIe 3.0, which you can see is pretty much twice as fast. So again, this is gigabytes per second. So in gigabits, it would be 8 times that. So you'd be looking at a little bit upwards of 100 gig in theory for a 16, an X16 card. So in theory, you could have an X8 card that could also handle that 40 gig connection. You couldn't have an X4 card. We have our 10 gig cards now, our SFP Plus cards that are X8. You couldn't put that onto an X4. It just wouldn't work. As the technology improves, obviously going from V1, 2, 3, 4, you're able to get those speed gains and fit more onto fewer pins. But there is some minimum that you need. With our 10 gig stuff, we need an X8. If you see a 10 gig that says X4, either it's PCI 3.0 or it's a lie.
Can we get all 4 of those different chipsets, or all of ours are just Intel?
Most of ours are Intel. Where possible, we try to get Intel. Our supplier has some cards where, maybe the 2SFP Plus card, they have Intel, we get Intel typically, but they also have Broadcom and we just choose not to buy it. Intel is often the most expensive one, but again, it's the industry standard, it's the main brand, so we try to go that route because it's not significantly more expensive. And then some of our cards, they don't have Intel, they don't have Broadcom, they'll just have a Realtek or a Avaya. If we can avoid Realtek or Avaya, we can avoid those, but there are some cases where that is all they offer. On our site, we actually show exactly which chipset we do have, but we don't show the different options. We don't advertise saying you can get this card with either a Broadcom or an Intel chipset. We just say the Intel chipset, and I guess you'd have to just come to me if they're specifically asking for a different chipset.
Yeah, because I've had a guy that wants the Broadcom, but I think I just tried to convince him that it doesn't matter with the PCI card.
In general, it doesn't, and again, it's that whole engineer argument where one guy might say Broadcom's better, another guy might say Intel's better. I have no idea. I don't think anyone here would have any idea. I think you could go to someone at Intel who might not even say, oh yeah, Intel's definitely better. there's probably some functionality that's marginally different that might give a slight improvement to one guy or another. It could be that he already has a Broadcom card in there and just wants it to have
Right.
that same compatibility. Some cases, again, we can get it, but some cases we can't. It's kind of just hit or miss. We're not going to bother skewing up two of the same cards with different chipsets.
Right.
Okay.
In the product description, are we actually mirroring what Intel says? I don't know if you recall, we had an issue where the guy was asking dimensions, and I don't know if our image was incorrect or our description was incorrect, but he was questioning whether it would actually fit in the server that he had, and I wasn't sure if he was looking at the image, and that was his concern because we had the wrong image, or that we didn't have complete data,
Yeah.
and he was looking for more dimension information on whether it would fit in the server.
It is possible that some of the images are outdated, so it's probable that he was looking at the image and thought that maybe it wouldn't work. I mentioned the full profile and the low profile. As well, there are some servers that only take half-length cards, and we don't have any half-length cards. You can imagine the card would just get cut off there and fit in a much smaller space. We don't have anything like that. Something like our PCIe 4RJ45, our supplier is actually able to make one where they squeeze all 4 ports into a much smaller space and make it the half-height card. So we can get that. They've actually sent us some of those before. They seem to just make them both arbitrarily. We didn't realize we needed to specify which we wanted. But somebody might look at this picture and say, oh, that won't fit in my server, but then we could go and order one from the supplier that would actually fit in their server.
And we have those dimensions if need be.
Yeah, or if not, we can get them. I don't know if the dimensions are specifically up on the site. And again, some of these are older cards that are from an old supplier. We don't even carry the red card like that anymore. It's generally a standard size that it's either half height or full height, and then full length or half length. And again, we have no half length. So generally it's just that almost all of our cards are that half height, and they should fit in any system that's also full length.
Good enough.
Any other questions? Is that sufficiently quick, Art?
Yeah, that was good.
So yeah, I'm around if you have any questions. Patrick is around if you have any questions. They're generally pretty simple. I mean, we don't get too much into the technical stuff just because we're not here developing these. We're using the Intel spec. If I have a question about if our card will do something, generally I can look at Intel's data sheets to figure that stuff out. So if there are questions, send them along, and hopefully I can answer the question.
Cool.
Thank you.
Matt.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And
Did it work?
it says low battery. Oh, it's still running. How do I stop this? Whose is it?